You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that distance? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I was looking for a new video to debunk and decided to see what our old friends at Genesis Apologetics had been up to. There were two recent videos, one about human evolution and one about dinosaurs. Well, I'm going to let Gutsick Gibbon handle the former, but I'm here for the latter. And also let me say this video was uploaded at 29.97 FPS. If you're out there making videos, never use 29.97 FPS, just use 24, 25, 30, or 60 FPS. There is no reason to use this not quite 30 FPS unless you're broadcasting color TV in the United States. But what do you expect? Creationists, it seems, can't get anything right. Anyway, let's see what Dan Biddle and friends have for us this time.
Natural history museums spend millions on displays that promote the idea that an asteroid impact hitting the edge of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico 66 million years ago was responsible for the final dinosaur extinction. While evolutionists have published over 90 different theories about this dinosaur extinction event, the asteroid theory takes the leading place in museums today.
I'm not sure why there's such an emphasis on how much a museum display costs, although the one shown here didn't look like it was more than a few tens of thousands of dollars. But yes, like everything in science, the question of what killed the non-avian dinosaurs and most other things at the end of the Cretaceous has been explored in every available way. That's how you do science. You test every possibility that seems reasonable until one of them ends up doing the best to retrodict past data and predict future data. As it turns out, right now we know that around the end Cretaceous there was a huge impact event near what is now the Yucatan, and that there is a worldwide deposit of Iridium, which is common in asteroids, but not on Earth. And at that point, we see the abrupt transition from the Mesozoic fauna of the Cretaceous to the Cenozoic fauna of the Paleogene. Other factors may well have been at play, but it seems like the impact was the big boy in terms of what caused this mass extinction.
But have you considered how this single event could explain the simultaneous extinction of all dinosaurs around the world, including a massive dinosaur kill zone in North America that spans 3 countries and 14 states, stretching over 1,800 miles long and 1,000 miles wide?
Well, first, the extinction probably wasn't simultaneous in the sense that it would have taken a single day. I'm sure some organisms clung on for a few months, maybe even a few years. Heck, it wouldn't really be all that shocking to find a few small non-avian dinosaurs had clung on into the Paleogene, although we have no such fossils. And no, the asteroid did not result in any massive dinosaur kill zones. I don't even know what we're talking about here. No one is seriously suggesting that the fossils we have from the end Cretaceous were directly caused by the asteroid, with a possible few exceptions. Virtually no fossils are of animals directly killed by the Chicxulub impact event at the end of the Cretaceous.
Over 1 million square miles across the American West are filled with every...
Hold up. What is that? That's the Allosaurus from Ark Survival Evolved. Why are we using a cartoonishly bad reconstruction of a dinosaur that lived in the Jurassic period that ended some 79 million years before the Cretaceous even started, when we're talking about the end Cretaceous? Once again, creationists can't get anything right.
Over 1 million square miles across the American West are filled with every kind of dinosaur, and they're all mixed with other land animals.
I guess that's just what we're going to do then. Mix up the Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous with just all of the Mesozoic. Great. Let's just hear them out.
Including birds and all sorts of marine life, like clams, rays, and sharks.
Okay, I was curious about these maps, and since Genesis Apologetics was so kind as to credit the creator of them, that is, STEM and Design, who in fact do make some pretty cool maps, I was able to find out how they got these. These maps are from paleodb.org, where there is a navigator. I managed to generate this exact map. You know what that's a map of? Every single dinosaur in the area shown from the entire Mesozoic, birds included. Seriously, you select the filters Mesozoic and Dinosauria, and that's what pops up. So right now, Genesis Apologetics is trying to say that scientists think that the Chicxulub impactor killed every dinosaur we have ever found across the whole of the Mesozoic, a time span of 180 million years. Tell you what, Dr. Dan Biddle, founder of Genesis Apologetics, you shoot me an email and you let me know why you think that paleontologists think that a coelophysis that they say died about 190 million years ago was killed by an asteroid those same scientists think hit 66 million years ago. Do you think the mainstream says this is a time-traveling asteroid? It went back in time to kill all the dinosaurs that ever lived? Was it the series finale of Star Trek The Next Generation?
In addition, many of these layers filled with dinosaurs are stacked one on top of the other,
as you would expect from the result of deposition of sediments over geological time. So I might as well explain what the coloration on the map means. Purple is for Triassic, blue is for Jurassic, and green is for Cretaceous. The colors get lighter as that period goes on, so deep purple is only for the early Triassic, and the lightest purple is from the Radian stage, the last part of the Triassic. So again, they're keeping Mesozoic as a filter, and then just cycling through different groups of organisms, as if they're all supposed to have been killed in a single event. Only creationists think that the fossil record is largely a result of a single event. This isn't Duel of the Catastrophes, flood versus asteroid, winner take all.
Could a single asteroid that hit over 1,500 miles away from the heart of this disaster zone really be responsible for all this? Stay tuned to find out.
No, it couldn't. And no one thinks it was. Like seriously, no one. This has got to be the flimsiest strawman in creationist history. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Before you can seriously tackle an idea, you should be able to articulate it well enough that proponents of that idea would agree that your statement is in fact what they believe. If you can't do that, then you can't actually dispute the idea in question because you don't actually know what it is. If you want to dispute basically all of geology and taphonomy, that's great, but you'd better know what the conclusions that have been reached in those fields actually are. But then, of course, if you knew that much, there's a chance you just realize the Earth is in fact old, and that the flood doesn't explain a single thing about it, because it absolutely did not happen.
An asteroid hitting the Yucatan Peninsula would certainly have regional consequences that could easily spread over part of present-day Central America. But the billions of fossils in the middle of North America were buried in multiple mud, sand, and volcanic ash layers from successive watery events.
Right, which isn't what an asteroid or global flood would do. An asteroid impact wouldn't result in much actual deposition of anything besides some tsunami near the coasts, and a flood would result in one or a few layers of turbidite with mostly the same composition. Instead, we have multiple strata, only some of which are turbidites, no worldwide turbidite deposit, and many deposits that show they cannot have formed under floodwaters, such as non-flocculated shale, limestone, stone with clear bioturbations, meaning they had to form slowly, deposits showing varves, which require still waters, fossil raindrops, fossilized tracks in sand. All of these cannot form in a flood. Now, they're not going to be formed by an asteroid impact either, but no one is making that claim.
And some of these layers are hundreds of feet thick and stretch over multiple states in the US. How could a single asteroid falling well over 1,000 miles away from the center of this area bury dinosaurs across 14 US states under hundreds of feet of mud, sand, and volcanic ash?
It couldn't, and no one thinks it did.
For example, look at the Lance Formation. This geological unit spreads across several states and is packed with fossils of many sorts of land, air, and marine creatures, including small and large dinosaurs, pterosaurs, fish, mammals, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, turtles, birds, frogs, and salamanders.
Okay, let's look at the Lance Formation. It's from the very last part of the Cretaceous. It was formed along the transition from braided streams to river deltas to the coast of the western interior seaway. It certainly wasn't a flood, because while bioturbation is rare, the formation is almost entirely non-turbidite sandstone, although there is a lot of seismite, which forms as a result of earthquakes. It also includes brown-gray mudstone, which had to have resulted from still water with fine silt particles and also bits of chewed-up plants, which are present in it. It contains fossils throughout, but of particular interest is a bone bed made up almost entirely of Edmontosaurus annectens. The bone bed was created when an area that had already had Edmontosaurus skeletons that had been buried and decayed to the point of having no flesh formed. Then an earthquake caused liquefaction of the mud the bones were buried under, and this mud then drained to its current location, resulting in the bones being graded with the biggest at the bottom and the smallest at top. This could not be the result of animals dying in a flood, because then they would have been buried as mostly articulated skeletons with no strong grading of the bones by size. Now, Dapper, you may say, where did you get this information? Well, I'll tell you. I got it from a thesis called Depositional Model of a Late Cretaceous Dinosaur Fossil Concentration, Lance Formation, by Summer Rose Weeks. This paper was published by Loma Linda University, a Seventh-day Adventist and Young Earth Creationist school. It was approved by Leonard Brand, Arthur V. Chadwick, and Kevin E. Nick. I can't find much on Nick, but Brand and Chadwick are Young Earth Creationists. So apparently the flood doesn't at all explain the Lance Formation, and that's according to Young Earth geologists.
It's quite obvious that entire ecosystems were buried here during Noah's flood. Professor Art Chadwick explains,
Oh hey, Chadwick! Let's see if he contradicts the work of his own student that he approved of enough to let her use it to get her degree and publish.
Well, the Lance Formation extends most of the way across Wyoming, and then it goes into South Dakota, and the name's changed to Hill Creek Formation, and then it goes into Montana, and so South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and then there's an equivalent formation up in Drumheller in Canada where they find the dinosaurs up there, and they're also finding these same dinosaurs up in Alaska.
Well, some of the same animals, such as the aforementioned Edmontosaurus, but Alaska didn't have all of the same animals. For example, there are no Tyrannosaurus finds in Alaska, but we do find Nanosaurus, a different Tyrannosauroid. Also, while there are no Triceratops in Alaska, we do find Pachyrhinosaurus, a different ceratopsian. And hey, you know what source I use for that? paleodb.org, the same source this video uses for where fossils are found. So no, it's not true to say that the Maastrichtian fauna of Alaska is the same as that of the Lance Formation, although there is some overlap. And actually, as it turns out, after some very recent reanalysis of the Edmontosaurus specimens from Alaska, they've turned out to be distinct enough to warrant not only a new species, but their own genus, Ugrunaluk. So, sorry there, Dr. Chadwick, you're either ill-informed or dishonest. Now, you're a professor of biology at Loma Linda University, so let my audience decide if it's ill-informed or dishonest.
So we're talking about a large part of North America.
What caused all the dinosaurs to go extinct? You mentioned the asteroid, but now let's talk about from a Genesis paradigm. How do we explain that?
When we look at the fossil record of dinosaurs, we find that they are killed off in layers. Also, we have the Triassic kinds of dinosaurs here, and then we have the Jurassic kind of dinosaurs higher up, and then we have the Cretaceous kind of dinosaurs at the very top.
Kind of the exact thing you wouldn't expect from a flood, since floods tend to just jumble things from their entire extent together, regardless of environment. Let's take as an example the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. This river floods irregularly, but let's imagine a particularly bad flood. The river starts up in the mountains, it washes down into what is now farmland, but would otherwise contain trees, grasses, etc. Then as it loses some volume and goes through areas that are mostly just desert, it picks up some volume from Lake Terthar, goes through some much wetter area, and eventually empties into a marshy delta at the northeast end of the Persian Gulf. So if this were to flood, we would expect plants and animals from all the environments involved to all be deposited together in a graded turbidite deposit, because while the debris would be picked up sequentially as it goes, it all gets mixed in, as the head of the floodwaters is what picks up most of it in the first place. So when the flood is over, there should be no ecological zonation.
And right at the very top, we find Tyrannosaurus rex and these duck-billed dinosaurs and the kind of things we're studying in Wyoming, because we're just right below that layer which ends the Cretaceous. And so I think this process of burial couldn't just be explained by a single asteroid.
Yeah, but the question wasn't, can a single asteroid explain the entirety of the Mesozoic? Because that's stupid, and no one thinks it does explain that.
It has to involve something, dare I say, much bigger than that, and certainly on a grander scale that encompasses the whole Earth.
Okay, so this right here contradicts that paper that Dr. Chadwick himself signed off on in September 2016. Now, I have been unable to find anything about when this interview took place exactly. I called Dr. Chadwick up on the phone and asked, and he said it was late 2016 or early 2017, but couldn't really remember. Now, I suspect, but cannot demonstrate, that this means that it was after September when the interview took place. If that's the case, then his signing off on the paper by Summer Rose Weeks means that he knew that the fossil record of dinosaurs was not caused by something global, and that in some cases it required a long time to form and still tranquil waters. Or it means he knowingly signed off on bad research. That means that Dr. Chadwick has just committed academic fraud. Either he changed his mind at some point around late 2017 and failed to retract his earlier statements, or he is simply endorsing contradictory views in different outlets. Either of these is academic fraud. Dr. Chadwick has just removed himself from the rank of scholars and now stands firmly in the charlatan category. This is how it will stand until and unless he retracts either his views in Weeks 2016 or his views in Is Genesis History. As a result, Chadwick is not worthy of his doctorate, and I will no longer refer to him as if he had such a degree.
And we find evidence for this in the direction of currents that are flowing over the surface of the Earth. For example, in the rocks, If you've ever seen cross-bedded sandstone, it's sandstone that lies at an angle like this. That sandstone tells us which direction the current was moving that deposited that sand. If we look at these flow of currents over the surface of the Earth and in all these different layers of rock, from the Cambrian all the way up to the top, we find out that it seems to be going the same way over wide areas of the Earth.
So here's the problem with that. Chadwick is cherry-picking his own data. He's not even misrepresenting just the consensus, he's misrepresenting his own research. Chadwick himself researched and published a dataset containing thousands of data points on paleocurrents from around the world, and he found no stronger continent scale directionality in them than we see today for any time period. In every case where you check the paleocurrents on any given continent in a particular point in the stratigraphic column, less than half of paleocurrents are in the supposed preferred direction. Sure, it's sometimes most or more than, say, a quarter of the rivers were going in one direction or another, but so what? Look at South America. Nearly all the rivers tend to go from west to east. You know why? Because the continent kind of slopes to the west. You know, because of the Andes. Similarly, in much of the eastern seaboard of the United States, most rivers flow west to east, but get across the Appalachians and they go east to southwest. Because, you know, the Appalachians. So even if his own data didn't disprove him, they would still be unremarkable, except that we'd have to wonder why most currents during the Mesozoic were so dominated by single mountain ranges. Turns out we don't have to wonder that, because they weren't. Now, I want to give a thank you to Vice Rhino, who did a lot of the legwork on this one for me, as well as Corporal Anon, who found the raw data for me and pointed me towards Vice Rhino.
Like there's some kind of flow taking place that's different from anything we have today. Today we have a basin, the sediments go into that basin from all sides, and we would see evidence of currents flowing into that basin. In the fossil record, what we see is the currents tend to ignore the basins. They tend to go right across the basins, and they tend to be looking at something much bigger than just a part of North America, for example. And in fact, the currents in North America and South America behave the same way, just to give you one example.
Not according to your own data, Mr. Chadwick, or according to the data that Ms. Weeks presented to you, and to which you have raised no objection, as far as I can tell.
So that, to me, suggests that in the development of the fossil record, we had processes going on that were bigger than anything we can imagine today. It doesn't say today's processes continued over a long period of time would have produced this. It says the only reasonable way to produce this is to have processes that are not going on the Earth today.
Except, as I've already pointed out in the previous video, link above, there actually is no dominant current flow that is unusual in any of the Mesozoic strata that you're talking about. It just doesn't exist. You're lying. And I know, because I know you know, because you collected the data.
When you look at the rocks themselves, you don't see evidence for the passage of a lot of time. And Dr. Brandon and I have been working on this for the last 15 years, just going through tens of thousands of meters of sediment, looking for evidence of the passage of time between the layers. And the evidence would be that the layers have been disrupted or resuspended or moved around by organisms or roots or...
Oh, so bioturbation. Like that paper by Weeks said was present in the formation you yourself dig in? The Lance Formation? Yeah, if you're not finding that, it's because you're not trying to. Bioturbation is common all through the Phanerozoic, as are in-situ roots, paleosols, soil horizons, you know, all the things you'd expect if ordinary events are taking place over deep time.
Or whatever processes. Once you deposit a layer, if it's just sitting there for a year, say nothing of 100 years or 1,000 years, that layer is going to be affected by its environment.
So in the current process today, if we have some sediment that gets laid down, what you're saying is that there are processes going on that would radically change that layer.
Sure. Roots penetrate soil and move it around. Organisms, if it's, well, even above sea level, but below sea level, you have worms that live all over the bottom and other organisms, and they're burrowing constantly in the sediment. That's where they get their food. And so if you bring in a new supply of food for them, they're going to devour that, and they're going to mess up all the internal structure. So we look at these layers and we say, is the internal structure still there, or has it been disrupted by organisms, which equals time? Not a lot of time necessarily, but time. If you see no disruption, then you're going to have a hard time explaining that sediment in a long period of time.
And what did you find down in the fossil
We
records?
found tens of thousands of meters with no disruption whatsoever. One layer after layer after layer after layer. And we were looking at it in a centimeter scale. We were walking through thousands of meters of sediment, looking at centimeter level disruptions. And they're very difficult to find. You can find them once in a while, but not the kind that we would expect if there'd been the passage of a lot of time.
So we need bioturbation to be rare in the fossil record, and Mr. Chadwick says that it is vanishingly so. But the funny thing is that his own university, again, Loma Linda, has published a paper on the taphonomy, extent, and intensity of bioturbation in the Moenkopi Formation of Utah. This is Taphonomy of Sediments, Bioturbation in the Triassic Moenkopi Formation in southwestern Utah, by James Vernon Bird, published April 2016, almost certainly before this interview. In it, Bird measured bioturbation levels throughout the entire vertical extent of the formation, and it is essentially omnipresent. Only a tiny fraction of the formation can be determined to lack bioturbation. The only kind of rock in the whole formation without it is that formed by sandy clay. So from his own university, we know Chadwick is wrong. But even so, every time you hear about fossil trackways, which are common, that also defeats the idea of a flood. What I'm getting at is that Chadwick is either incompetent or he knows better.
Doesn't it make perfect sense that these widespread mud, sand, and ash layers, which are filled with dinosaur bones, were deposited by a worldwide flood?
At this point, the video puts in clips of some 18 or so documentaries about dinosaurs, in which the presenters talk about the dinosaurs in question being buried in water in general, or floods specifically. Since I have no contest with the idea that the majority of sedimentary rock is deposited by water, and neither does anyone else, I see no point to this. And since it took up about 2.5 minutes of screen time, I'm not going to show it. You can see the original video if you want to see the montage for yourself.
It's fascinating to see how many secular paleontologists admit that dinosaurs died in watery catastrophes.
If by fascinating you mean completely ordinary and expected, then sure, because the existence of watery catastrophes, also note the use of the plurals both by this Genesis Apologetics guy and myself, are not unusual. They're not controversial. No one thinks they don't happen.
This leading book that catalogs most of the largest bone beds in the world admits that most of them were laid down by watery catastrophes.
Okay, but it also says a bunch of them were laid down by drought, almost as many as by flood. So, either they have garbage methodology, or this is no evidence at all for it. I mean, come on, you actually put up the graph, and it had a big old yellow chunk for drought. How does a group of animals die from a drought in a global flood? Seriously, I don't even need a source beyond this very video to debunk this point. Please do better, Genesis Apologetics. Oh, and as a side note, it also lists ashfall and predation, so not exactly seeing how this pie chart helps.
When looking at the largest of these dinosaur bone beds in Canada, secular scientists widely admit they were formed by dramatic high-speed water events.
Yeah, but what about the ones that aren't? You're cherry-picking. Talk about the ones that were caused by drought. How do you square that with a flood? No one says that floods don't happen and that they didn't kill dinosaurs. You have to show that all fossils formed that way simultaneously. Pointing out that animals were killed by a flood doesn't help you because no one says that doesn't happen.
Let's not forget the most obvious clue about dinosaur extinction. They're all buried in sedimentary rock. There may be ash from volcanoes mixed in.
No, just mixed in. We have subaerial ash deposits with fossils. Subaerial is just like subterranean or submarine. But where those mean underground or under the ocean, subaerial just means under the air. Or in more usual terms, in open air. Subaerial ash beds are not ash mixed with water. They're ash mixed with air, and we have fossils in them.
But most dinosaur fossils have to be chiseled out of mud and sand layers. Many of these rock units laid down in a layer cake manner commonly span thousands of square miles.
Yeah, because most sediment is laid down by water, but isn't from a flood. Interestingly, the illustration that was just up on screen showed the bones deposited in a graded bed, as we see in the Edmontosaurus bed in the Lance Formation. But as can be seen in the Weeks paper I keep referencing, that can't happen if the animals die directly in a flood. The bones would not be so finely graded. In fact, they would hardly be graded at all. The animals need to die, decay for a bit, and only then be swept up in a flood or mudslide.
What's unique about the dinosaurs is that they are found in the very mud and sand that killed them, often twisted about and disarticulated.
Except that no, we know that the more disarticulated the animal, the less likely the sediment around them is associated with the cause of death. I mean, just look at dead animals after a flood. They aren't ripped to shreds. Sure, you'll find a missing extremity here or there, and plenty of broken bones, but they aren't shredded. Floods aren't like industrial juicers tearing up bodies until nothing is left.
How could an asteroid impact all the way down in Mexico deposit these extensive mud and sand layers that are hundreds of feet thick and stretch literally for thousands of miles?
For the 5th time, it can't, it didn't, and no one thinks that.
An asteroid would certainly create a crater on the Earth's surface with mud and sand layers thinning out from the crater, but the actual dinosaur bone layers in the American West remain about the same thickness for hundreds of miles.
Right, because in the areas you're looking at, they were deposited over the course of about 130 million years, not in one event. It's your side who thinks that they were deposited in one event. No actual scientists say that all these layers are the result of a single event, including the Chicxulub event. And yes, I'll say it. You can't be a scientist in basically any field besides maybe like optics and be a young Earth creationist. Because you need to be both honest and well-informed to be a scientist, and you can't be both while being a young Earth creationist.
Noah's flood could do that, but an asteroid would not.
Nope, neither could and neither did. The flood simply didn't happen, and just the mere existence of Mesozoic subaerial Aeolian and evaporite deposits prove that conclusively, no matter what else you can say about the geological record.
The Bible says that surging floodwaters took months to cover the entire globe.
Okay, so let's read Genesis 7:17 through 20.
And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth. And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went up on the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered.
I mean, 40 days and 40 nights is more than a month, but calling it months seems a little far-fetched. Saying months and not qualifying it says to me at least 2, and probably more months. So we have just over 1 month of rising water according to the narrative.
Sure enough, dinosaurs are found in sequentially laid mud and sand layers all over the Earth. Deposition of these layers must have occurred quickly one after the other, because the upper surface of each layer is flat without erosion, indicating hardly any time passing before the next layer was laid on top of it by the next huge flood surge.
Buried ancient landscapes are 100% a thing. We know of ancient valleys complete with strata and erosion channels that were infilled by sedimentation. So no, the layers are not just flat with no signs of erosion. That's simply false.
The other challenge for the asteroid theory is that the Cretaceous fossils that cover multiple states in the middle of North America are at elevations hundreds of feet higher than the current ocean level could have placed them.
Right, current ocean level changes. They're currently slowly rising.
Even secular scientists explain that the only way to get these extensive fossils to their current elevation is through the massive flooding, followed by buckling of the continent.
Nope, that paper you cited right there said sea transgression. A sea transgression happens when ocean levels rise and slowly water fills the low-lying parts of a continent. That's not a flood. A flood is a transient and usually high-energy event. Stop lying about things you're showing right on screen. You're debunking yourself. You're supposed to make me look stuff up, not just show that you're a blatant liar right on screen while you're talking.
Earth's rapidly subducting crustal plates during Noah's flood would have compressed and buckled the sedimentary layers deposited on the plates by cycles of numerous tsunamis flooding across the land.
No.
Those folded strata you showed were clearly defined rather than showing mixing between them. That means they had to have already lithified before folding. Lithification isn't a fast process, and once stone is lithified, it has to bend slowly or it will simply fracture. This simply cannot happen rapidly.
Killing and burying dinosaurs mixed with marine life, as high as the elevations where we find them today. A profound challenge for the asteroid theory of dinosaur extinction is that a single asteroid does not produce such multiple continent-wide fossil-packed layers. Most dinosaur fossils are contained in layers of mud that were laid down in successive fashion, one after the other, as if by repeating very large amplitude tsunamis.
Okay, this is for the young Earth creationists out there. Let's say that I said that Christianity is stupid because Christianity is the belief that the proper way to worship God is by doing upside-down jumping jacks. But since that's essentially impossible, Christianity is nonsense. You'd probably object by saying that Christianity says no such thing. You'd be right, it doesn't. So maybe stop strawmanning science and try to understand what it actually says. Further, tsunami deposits, both ancient and modern, are known in the geological record. Virtually none of the fossil record is contained in tsunami deposits.
These layers are often hundreds of feet thick and laterally continuous for thousands of miles.
As one would expect. Yes.
The well-developed catastrophic plate tectonics theory.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
I'm sorry, do you mean the catastrophic plate tectonics theory that even AIG admits can't work without, quote, exotic solutions, without which the proposed geological activities would release an amount of heat that would boil the oceans many times over and leave the arc just so much carbon on a white-hot molten Earth, covered by a choking poisonous haze of greenhouse gases? Catastrophic plate tectonics makes Venus look like a trip to a ski resort. Oh, and that's again according to Answers in Genesis. The creationists themselves know this can't work and isn't scientific, and so shouldn't at all be called a theory, except in the colloquial sense.
Accounts for these features in terms of rapidly subducting plates that repeatedly lock and then unlock and slip. Each slip event unleashes a large amplitude tsunami.
Wait, so this is happening while the waters aren't covering the Earth, according to your graphic. Which, granted, you probably got from the same mainstream documentary about seismology, but since you didn't clarify, I can only take what you have presented at face value.
These rapidly subducting plates resulted in enormous volcanism that spewed megatons of ash that entombed countless dinosaurs in multiple states. The evidence for this is obvious. For example, the Independence Dike Swarm is a system of linear fissures that erupted during the flood. This system extends over 370 miles in Southern California and belted out 4,000 cubic miles of ash that covered multiple states, leaving behind enormous ash deposits like the Brushy Basin Member, which is 110 meters thick in eastern Utah and found in 35 other locations around the region.
Okay, so the model here is that the waters are rising, but apparently not yet at the elevation of the Morrison Formation. The Jurassic supervolcano covers a bunch of dinosaurs in the Brushy Basin Member. Got it. So when that turns to rock, the kind of rock it should be is subaerial tuff. That being what subaerial tuff is, ash that falls out of the sky and turns to rock. Now we'll also say that maybe we could get some submarine tuff since the waters are rising at that point. Okay, so the Brushy Member Basin must be made of tuff, whether subaerial, submarine, or maybe a mix. Quick check of the literature, and what do you know? It's lacustrine and fluvial sandstone and mudstone. Darn. Well, I guess that whole idea just got tossed out the window. By the way, lacustrine means formed in lakes, and fluvial means formed in rivers or streams. Now why might a creationist think that the Brushy Member Basin was deposited by volcanic ash? The only thing I can find is that the sediments that were deposited were feldspathic. That is, that they were eroded bits of feldspar. Feldspar is igneous, and so I guess maybe you could make the leap from small bits of igneous rock to this must be ash. But that's not how it works at all. To be fair though, there are bits of ash in the member, but it is not even generally described as tuffaceous.
These ash beds are mixed with sandstone brought in from massive, mud-filled tsunamis generated by catastrophic rifting.
No.
The Brushy Member Basin isn't a tsunami deposit. In fact, most of it was low-energy deposition. You don't just get to say it was a tsunami.
The countless dinosaurs buried in this mixture is exactly what we would expect to find with a worldwide flood that involved rapid oceanic rifting, because both oceanic and volcanic upheaval was happening at the same time.
Except that A, when even creationists have to grapple with all the data at these fossil sites, the conclusion that they have to reach, based on the evidence, is that the flood cannot explain these sites. And B, this model wouldn't result in a deposition of fossiliferous strata, rather it would result in the whole world being a ball of molten, glowing, white-hot rock.
The case for the biblical flood grows even stronger when looking at how the strength of the volcanic systems and extent of the ash deposits declined after the flood.
Okay, so his source for this is the Institute for Creation Research, who in 1974 tried to set a maximum age of the Earth by using the rate at which various elements were entering the ocean, and how long they would take to reach current levels, assuming none in the oceans to start with. They have a table with their results on page 154 on the 23rd printing of Scientific Creationism by Henry Morris, which was printed in 2003. So for 29 years at least, they just didn't notice that on the table, they themselves say it would take only 2,000 years for lead to reach the current levels. Meaning that by their logic, the world came into being about the same time Jesus was born. So much for taking the Bible literally. Looks like by ICR's logic, the whole Old Testament just didn't happen. That doesn't make this chart necessarily wrong, but yeah, ICR as a source is about as reliable as a presidential candidate's promise. Here's the other thing. I can't actually find anything about tuff associated with the Independence dike swarm, and since this video doesn't actually list a source that I can check, besides just ICR, and that this video has already incorrectly identified a supposed tuff associated with the formation, I'm just gonna press X to doubt. I think this is just made up by pretending that things that aren't ash deposits are.
Truly, something big happened in the past that rapidly buried the dinosaurs in mud, sandstone, and ash. And it certainly wasn't an asteroid that fell over 1,500 miles away from the heart of this disaster zone.
No, many somethings in the past did that, and they generally weren't asteroid impacts.
The rapidly subducting oceanic plates created the Independence dike swarm during the flood, depositing 4,000 cubic miles of ash.
First of all, stop using miles. This is science. I'm sick of having to convert units, because no one in science uses the imperial system. If you want to tell me how long your walk was or how to bake a cake, fine, use imperial. I actually prefer it for those uses. But if we're doing science or engineering, it's time for metric. It's simpler, and it's in universal use, even in the USA. Second, again, X to doubt, because you have no source for this supposed ash bed. The closest you came was mentioning one member of the Morrison Formation that wasn't even tough in the first place. In fact, I actually conducted over the course of several hours a literature hunt to find out where in the technical literature this idea is coming from. Turns out, the closest I came is that because North America was experiencing high rates of volcanism during the Jurassic, most of the Morrison Formation rocks do contain ash, although rarely does it get to the 25% ash threshold to count as tuffaceous, and almost never is it actually tough. But what this means is that there were frequent but low-level volcanic eruptions that did not result in ash burying anything. At best, it would be a light coating, but repeated light coatings over the course of years. Because remember, ashfall has to be far lower than sedimentation rates, otherwise we'd get tuff or tuffaceous rock.
This was followed by a couple of major Yellowstone eruptions after the flood that deposited 600 and then 240 cubic miles of ash. This was later followed by the Long Valley eruption that produced 150 cubic miles of ash, then the Crater Lake eruption with only 17 cubic miles of ash, and finally the Mount St. Helens eruption, which deposited only 1/4 cubic mile of ash.
Well, since it seems that your only pre-flood eruption was really a series of eruptions over a long time, and didn't bury a single thing in ash as you said, it looks like the biggest eruptions are actually post-flood. Odd that.
Creationists are not alone in many of these perspectives. In fact, while museums have millions of dollars invested into portraying the asteroid extinction theory, did you know that the secular scientific community is far from settled on this idea? Over the last 30 years, hundreds of geologists have disagreed with the asteroid theory, believing instead that an extreme episode of volcanism explains the final dinosaur extinction.
Yeah, that's how science works. You debate different ideas and test every hypothesis that seems reasonable. And sure, it's entirely possible that there was more than one factor in the end Cretaceous mass extinction, as there is rarely only one factor in play when an organism goes extinct.
These scientists assert that it was the massive volcanic eruptions of basalt in India, called the Deccan Traps, that were primarily responsible for the dinosaur demise. These eruptions extruded over 288,000 cubic miles of lava, which is over 1 million times more voluminous than the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. We're talking about enough lava to cover the state of California a mile deep. Flood basalts like the Deccan Traps are found on several continents, usually with fossil-bearing sedimentary layers beneath them and further fossil-bearing sedimentary layers above them.
But you realize it's a problem, right? Like, those layers had to form and lithify before the intrusion of the flood basalt, because if they hadn't, then the upswelling basalt would never have preserved them as layers. It would have mixed them as the water they were still mostly made of boiled off. None of this works in a global flood.
Indicating they are also the result of spectacular, catastrophic processes during the Genesis flood.
I mean, catastrophic, sure, but there are reasons we can be damn sure it had nothing to do with a global flood. Not even by coincidence.
Princeton professor Dr. Gerda Keller has been at the forefront of this disagreement with the asteroid theory that started over 30 years ago. She has explained her findings at numerous GSA conferences, including this one.
At this point, there's an interview with Dr. Keller and some newswoman. In it, Dr. Keller explains her view that the formation of the Deccan Traps is the main factor in the KPG extinction. All I have to say is that she has yet to actually make any significant change to the general consensus that the known impact event was the major player in the mass extinction. But if she turns out to be right, that's great. It doesn't really help creationism or do anything to harm evolutionary theory, so I don't really feel like making you sit through a rather slow and dry interview.
Creationists have no problem with both the Chicxulub impact and the Deccan lava eruptions happening around the same time during the flood. In fact, the impact in Mexico and numerous others could have started or accelerated the Deccan eruptions and others during the flood by triggering the breakup of the fountains of the Great Deep mentioned in Genesis. Even some secular geologists have suggested that the impact in Mexico may have well triggered or accelerated the Deccan eruptions.
Okay, but so what? That's irrelevant to the question of whether there was a flood. Scientists don't think there was no global flood because they think an asteroid caused a mass extinction. They know there was no global flood because the basic facts of geology, chemistry, biology, etc. preclude it.
The evidence for large numbers of asteroid impacts during the flood is compelling. In fact, a survey found that 71 of 110 asteroid impacts are found in fossil-bearing sedimentary rock layers that were laid down by the flood.
Well, now you're just being circular. The flood was a time of heavy bombardment which caused the flood, and we know because the flood rock has lots of craters. Okay, but how do you know they were flood rocks? You don't because there's no evidence for it, and a mountain of evidence against it, in some cases in the form of literal mountains.
Most of the remaining 39 likely occurred after the flood. Indeed, the impact of a large asteroid may have well initiated the catastrophic movement of the tectonic plates at the onset of the flood. Once plate subduction was initiated, molten rock rose from below to fill rifts in the zones where plates were pulling apart.
No, it would have led to the word volcano being meaningless, because everywhere would be equally molten rock.
Disturbances in the Earth's interior from the rapidly subducting plates subsequently led to volcanic eruptions around the world. The dinosaur fossil record attests to this overall picture, with millions of creatures buried in muddy layers by subduction-driven tsunamis. Geologists have found that the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene layers, called the KPG boundary, in many regions is marked by high levels of the rare metal iridium. While it is true that nearly all dinosaur fossils are absent above this KPG boundary,
nearly all, huh? Tell you what, you find me the non-avian Paleogene dinosaur. It won't change anything, but it'll be really cool.
the areas with high iridium levels are not restricted to the thin zone that defines this boundary. In fact, in the same regions where the KPG boundary was discovered, recent studies have identified a 4-meter thick layer rich in iridium, not the thin line shown in most textbooks. These studies revealed that there was not a single iridium spike, but rather a horizon of peak values within a sequence of iridium-enriched clays that were most likely deposited by volcanic activity, as well as an asteroid, or series of asteroids.
Oh, recent papers, huh? Well, that's cool. Care to name them? They aren't listed in your description. I guess I just have to take your word for it. But actually, I'm going to take the word of Iridium Profiles and Delivery Across the Cretaceous Paleogene Boundary, a paper by Celine Emissary-Senlet et al., published in Earth and Paleontology Science Letters in 2017. They went to several locations to measure iridium levels across the vertical extent of the area near and including the KPG boundary. Here are some of the results. The iridium levels are in red. Notice how in each case there is a relatively thin spike and it corresponds to a visually distinct stratum? So basically, all that this boils down to is that the iridium anomaly occurs in areas of somewhat varying thickness, which is to be expected as the deposition rate at the end Cretaceous wouldn't be uniform globally. And also, volcanoes don't deposit clay. It's formed by chemical weathering, and also, there is no evidence that volcanoes can produce an iridium anomaly. If they do, then how come there isn't any such thing in most tuffs? Or the Brushy Basin Member you're so fond of?
Numerous scientists have taken the stance that these wide bands simply do not support the idea of a simple impact extinction event.
Well, the first paper is an odd one, and it also contradicts the second one. The first paper says the decline of the dinosaurs predated the Chicxulub impact, and that since in some areas the iridium layer is absent, the effects of the impact were likely local to the Americas, and further goes on to state that since birds are dinosaurs, the dinosaurs didn't go extinct. Of course, the second paper makes the opposite claim about the timing of the extinction event vis-a-vis the impact. So I'm not sure what the point of including both of them is. The third paper from 1988 concludes that the iridium layer was made by volcanism, but neither other paper agrees there, and, since 1988, more detailed isotopic analysis of the iridium anomaly, and there is now no real contest that it is extraterrestrial in nature. But really, the only reason to put this in here is to dispute that the meteor was the main cause of the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. But this isn't a dichotomy. If it turns out that it was a minor player compared to, say, the eruptions that formed the Deccan Traps, that doesn't make the flood any more likely. If Genesis Apologetics wants to say that it was a flood that caused the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, they will have to do a lot more than just point out that there are dissenters from the impact explanation for the end Cretaceous extinction.
In fact, Dr. Keller and other scientists invested over 30 years looking for evidence to support the Chicxulub impact in the Yucatan Peninsula as the cause for the KPG extinction event, and found very little evidence for such a conclusion. Although they found occurrences of iridium anomalies in Italy, Denmark, Tunisia, and India in the context of the KPG boundary, these were never associated with the Chicxulub impact ejecta.
Even if that's true, we still have no evidence for a global flood. And further, the work by Keller et al. Was very thoroughly overturned by the work of Schutt et al. In a 2010 paper, The Chicxulub Asteroid Impact and Mass Extinction of the Cretaceous Paleogene Boundary. In fact, there is ejecta more or less worldwide. It contains the expected elements like high iridium concentrations, inconsistent with volcanism, shock quartz, etc. But hey, why bother checking literature to see if your claims were already known to be wrong a decade before you made them, when almost 2 decades ago some people said something that you like more, even though it wouldn't help your case?
Other scientists have also been puzzled to find out there is virtually no iridium in the Chicxulub ejecta material itself, not in the layer at the base of the event deposit, nor in the ejecta layer above. This was not what evolutionists were expecting.
Again, what he said, as well as the on-screen claim that the impact predated the extinction event by some 300,000 years, is thoroughly overturned by Schutt et al. 2010.
How could the very asteroid impact site that was supposedly responsible for depositing all the iridium associated with the KPG boundary extinction not itself have iridium?
That would be odd, but in 2016, Jason C. Sanford, John W. Snedden, and Sean P. S. Gulick reported high concentrations of iridium in their drillings from the crater site in their paper, The Cretaceous Paleogene Boundary Deposition in the Gulf of Mexico, Large-Scale Oceanic Basin Response to the Chicxulub Impact, published in JGR, Solid Earth. So we have some guys from 2004 saying there's no iridium and not enough impact ejecta. But then it turns out both things have been found in the subsequent years. I wonder if Genesis Apologetics bothered to see what papers were out there. And of course, even if Keller et al. Were right, it wouldn't help creationism at all.
From a biblical history viewpoint, this makes perfect sense because volcanic eruptions also release iridium, and the resulting ash and dust clouds tend to spread worldwide.
True, but not in the concentrations seen, and they don't spread shock quartz, which the ejecta from Chicxulub has done. See, that's a problem if you want to claim the KPG iridium anomaly is volcanic in nature. That was reported all the way back in 2010 by Schutt again. Funny what a little bit of reading the technical literature can teach you.
This certainly appears to have been the case for the eruptions that produced the Deccan Traps. Indeed, airborne particles above Hawaiian basaltic eruptions have been found to be highly enriched in iridium, at levels much higher than at the KPG boundary.
Right.
I read that paper, and the peak enrichment was 50 times background. While the enrichment at the KPG varies, it goes all the way up to 120 times background, as reported by Alvarez in the original paper which proposed the Chicxulub impactor as the cause of the end Cretaceous mass extinction. That paper, by the way, is the extraterrestrial cause for the Cretaceous tertiary extinction from 1980 by a father and son team. It currently sits at 2,303 citations, with 52 of them having been from 2020 alone, and note that I checked that on October 1st of that year. It's not like this paper is not well accepted in the scientific community.
Certainly, asteroids that have impacted the Earth in the past must have contributed to iridium levels, especially in regions where the sedimentation rate was relatively slow and iridium fallout from the atmosphere could concentrate. This would have been true during the flood. However, since volcanism was so voluminous and widespread during the flood, this latter explanation seems to fit the data much better than does the asteroid hypothesis, including intervals that evolutionists identify as great extinction events within their worldview.
No, it fails to take into account the shock quartz. It fails to take into account the melt breccia in the Chicxulub crater. It fails to take into account the 2 high levels of iridium close to the crater, and the timing is off, with your supposed North American volcanism being Jurassic as opposed to the end Cretaceous timing of the Chicxulub impact. None of this works. Also, in case anyone doesn't know what breccia is, it's a kind of sedimentary rock with large angular chunks cemented by more fine-grained sediment, and it's what forms the crater floor of the Chicxulub crater.
Next, let's consider the timing of the asteroid impact and the dinosaur extinction. Natural history museums portray the asteroid as wiping out at least 2/3 of all species of life in just days, weeks, and months after the event. However, evolutionary dating now places the impact 100,000 to 300,000 years below the KPG boundary.
That was the conclusion of Keller et al., but again, that has been quite thoroughly refuted in the years since 2004. What he should have said is, but 16 years ago, one group of scientists said the impact predated the mass extinction by up to 300,000 years. Then, virtually all work since said that the two were geologically simultaneous. That would have been an accurate statement, although that it would be accurate itself may be reason enough not to say it for a professional young Earth creationist.
The biblical model, however, does not have any such dating challenges.
Here, I cut out a bit of him just repeating himself and giving Keller et al.'s reasoning. If you care, read the respective papers. But basically, Shute et al. Found that contrary to Keller et al., there were in fact ejecta particles in the sandstone in question, and the existence of early Cretaceous fossils was the result of reworking of the sandstone in question in the immediate wake of the impact, since the only other option would have been a similar impact in the early Cretaceous that left identical ejecta, but only in this one sandstone deposit, which had no other known effects. Since that is extremely unlikely, there is no reason to think the impact predated the extinction by any significant amount of time.
Biblical genealogies constrain the flood to just thousands of years ago, and implies that at least one of the assumptions behind radiometric dating is invalid.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
It's basically nothing but challenges, since it disagrees with basically every external verifiable dating method ever devised. But hey, let's see where we go with this.
The 14 different types of bioorganic materials, including blood vessels, collagen, and bone cells still found in dinosaur bones, also lends powerful support to the biblical timeline.
No.
So here's Mary Schweitzer on that again. I don't think I need to add to it.
It is interesting in the note that the rates program that the Young Earth Creationist had, all of them actually agreed that the isochron dating methods did indicate an old Earth, and that the physics was correct, except that they were trying to find a way to say that decay constants had changed. But they did acknowledge that these dates are accurate within the framework of the science that we know to be the case, as now. So I wanted to point that out. That
that bugs me. Why would God try to trick us?
That's a question we've asked them before.
That's really demeaning. It's like, okay, we're going to give you a brain and we're going to make a world of order, because order is something God's known for. He's rational. He's consistent. So we're going to make this world of order, and then, wow, we're going to trick you by saying that all the rules that you can figure out with your brain no longer apply. I don't buy that. God's not the deceiver in this. And I think that young Earth creationists have to be really, really careful when they sit there and try to manipulate the data to support their worldview. That is not science.
Of course, that clip is from Steve McRae's channel, link in the top right.
Consistent with the biblical time frame, both asteroids and volcanism were concurrent with tsunami waves and crustal deformation induced by catastrophic plate tectonics, which was the ultimate driver of dinosaur extinction.
Since radiometric dating can be cross-checked, since all of the assumptions are actually conclusions from other parts of science, and since the assumptions can actually be checked, it is radiometric dating, which means that your literalist reading of the Bible cannot be correct. Physical reality is prior to the Bible. We test the Bible, or at least our interpretation of it, against reality. When they conflict, reality wins, and you can reject the Bible or change your interpretation.
Let's look at a recent fossil bed that supports these conclusions. In 2019, the discovery of the Tannis Fossil Bed in North Dakota was announced, a discovery that many paleontologists are calling the find of the century. This 2-acre fossil bed is a snapshot of what North America looked like at the peak of the Genesis flood. This site is full of fossils, many in upright rather than flat positions, including trees, plants, and saltwater mosasaurs mixed with thousands of complete freshwater paddlefish and sturgeons.
Okay, the paper describing this is from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, or PNAS for short. The paper is A Seismically Induced Onshore Surge Deposit at the KPG Boundary, North Dakota, published April 23, 2019, by Robert A. De Palma et al. Although one of the people in the et al. Is Walter Alvarez. You know, the one from the paper I mentioned earlier that was the one that first really proposed the asteroid hypothesis. This doesn't matter a whole lot, I just thought it was cool. Anyway, this paper doesn't mention mosasaurs at all. Now, there is a mix of marine and freshwater organisms, and the paper claims that the marine organisms were washed into the freshwater area by an unusual blast caused by currents, and that the more marine organisms may have already been in a brackish rather than fully marine area. And let's not forget, at the end Cretaceous, the Hell Creek Formation, where this site is, was adjacent to the eastern coast of Laramidia, bordering the western side of the Western Interior Seaway, so it's no surprise to see some mixing after a catastrophic event. I am not competent to assess the claim that this mixing was caused by marine organisms being moved into a normally freshwater environment, so I will leave it to the viewer to take a look at the paper. Also, the vertical position simply indicates the rapidity of the depositional event that caused the fossil bed. But that is not surprising, an asteroid impact isn't subtle or slow.
The pristine condition of the fossils suggests that they were recovered almost immediately after death. But the most amazing thing about this site is that the creatures here were buried with millions of microtectites, tiny blobs of glass that form when molten rock is blasted into the air by an asteroid impact and then fall back to Earth as smoking hot projectiles about the size of BBs. These were found jammed into the gills of about half of the fossilized fish, in amber, and buried into small mud dents around the site. Some believe these microtectites at this site are connected to the Chicxulub asteroid falling about 1,900 miles away. They also found broken remains from almost all known dinosaur categories in the area, including eggs and hatchlings, and a Triceratops hip complete with tissue impressions, indicating a rapid death and burial. Even the evolutionary scientists admit this bone bed was caused by a flood. Specifically, 2 massive tsunamis they believe were initiated by Chicxulub impact 1,900 miles south.
Yeah, that's right. That's what we'd expect to see in a coastal region after such an impact. But I do not. But I do want to point out that you have just admitted that mainstream geologists know a tsunami deposit or tsunamite when they see it. So why don't they agree with you that virtually all of the Mesozoic strata are tsunamite? Oh, because they're obviously not tsunamite. Got it.
Biblical creationists, however, find evidence that leads to much broader flooding, mostly coming from rapidly subducting plates along the west coast of the continent.
Except there is no such evidence, because if there were, then mainstream scientists would have noticed all the tsunamite throughout the Mesozoic strata, as you just admitted they are willing and able to do.
Their research paper well established that this site was the result of at least 2 successive tsunamis, evidenced by the combination of land and marine creatures mixed together.
No, that would be a mix of freshwater and marine organisms in a freshwater environment. Land organisms actually end up in marine sediments all the time, because they drown, get washed out to sea in a storm, etc. But it's far more rare for freshwater organisms to end up in saltwater deposits, and it's exceedingly rare for marine organisms to end up in a freshwater environment.
The 3D condition of the fossils, and the various age groups within each species, indicating a complete snapshot in time. The fossil fish also had clear signs of tetany, a condition indicating sudden death due to poisoning, asphyxiation, and choking. They're also clear that at least 2 major tsunamis occurred one right after the other, proven by rapid sedimentation and a 100-degree change in flow direction, indicating inundation and backflow phases. They also found no evidence of roots or burrows, nor of branches with attached leaves at the boundary between the tsunami layers.
You mean the kind of thing even some creationists like Dr. Chadwick and Miss Weeks from Loma Linda University admit that we do find in other parts of the Mesozoic, indicating that these are not tsunamite deposits or turbidite deposits, like you would require? Got it.
Another fossil site that supports the global flood as the explanation behind the dinosaur extinction is the Hansen Ranch bone bed in the Lance Formation of eastern Wyoming. This 80-acre dinosaur graveyard contains over 1 million bones, many of which are concentrated in a thin 1 to 2 meter layer of mudstone. One 500-meter square excavation area has yielded over 8,000 bones, most of which belong to hadrosaurs. Scientists believe they were killed by a catastrophic event, and their bones were later redeposited just weeks or months later, because the bones are in a graded bed with big bones at the bottom and little bones at the top, a condition that requires sorting during a catastrophic emplacement. After these dinosaurs were killed by the initial event, their bodies floated, rotted, broke apart, and then just weeks or months later, massive amounts of water and mud picked up the collection of dead creatures and hydrologically sorted the bones, depositing them where they are today.
This is accurate, but I hear a but coming.
But here is the amazing thing. It's not just the Hansen Ranch that has tons of hadrosaur bones buried like this. Similar hadrosaur bone beds are all over America. In fact, when comparing the representation of the various types of bones found at this site to 5 other hadrosaur bone beds in Alaska, Montana, South Dakota, and Wyoming, scientists made an incredible finding. The types of bones found at these other locations were statistically significantly matched to the type of bones found at Hansen Ranch. This means that similar devastation and burial factors were in play at all 6 of these bone beds, evidenced by all sites having higher percentages of large limb and rib bones and low percentages of smaller bones, like vertebrae and chevrons.
So what? Hadrosaurs were probably herd-dwelling, and they were extremely common, filling a similar niche to today's deer, who are also very numerous. Floods occur, and they can sweep up herds. Further, the similarity in flood-deposited graded bone beds in terms of which bones are preserved is to be expected even in somewhat dissimilar events, because the smaller a bone is, the more likely it is to be entirely swept away, crushed, or to have been carried off by a scavenger wholesale in the first place. The whole fossil record has a bias in favor of large bones. None of this even hints that these bone beds were formed simultaneously.
Scientists believe these unique burial conditions were caused by an initial death event, followed by temporary emplacement where decay and disarticulation occurred. Then hydraulic winnowing removed the connected sections, like vertebral columns and smaller bones, before the remaining bones were swept away by underwater debris flow that later resulted in the final deposit. Such a multi-phase watery catastrophe doesn't line up with a single asteroid event, does it?
No, but it's not supposed to, so again, no problem there.
What happened here and at the other correlated sites was clearly the result of a worldwide flood.
No, it was the result of flooding. We have a long way to go to overcome the evidence against a global flood before that even becomes a viable hypothesis. That flood deposits exist is not evidence that a global flood occurred, for the simple reason that we know floods occur and deposit sediment today. Therefore, they could have done so in the past. So it follows that there should be flood deposits in the geological record of Earth. There are. Now, if there were a global flood, there should be a vertically correlated worldwide group of flood deposits. No such deposits exist. Therefore, there is no evidence of a global flood. Further, a flood can only deposit by means of water, and this video assumes that at least all Mesozoic strata are the result of a global flood. But since there are aeolian, that is deposited by wind, and subaerial, that is laid down in open air, but not really carried by the wind, deposits in the Mesozoic strata cannot have all been formed by a single flood.
Tsunamis from catastrophic rifting served the initial blow, killing these creatures and fracturing about 30% of their bones with green stick fractures that only occur with fresh bones.
It needn't only be weeks old. Bone is the slowest part of an organism to decay besides the teeth. Further, these aren't tsunamite deposits. And finally, plenty of things like rocks and tree trunks can fracture bones in a normal everyday flood.
There's something else that doesn't quite line up with the asteroid extinction theory. If the asteroid was responsible for the ultimate dinosaur wipeout, how did all the delicate creatures like mammals, frogs, birds, insects, fish, plants, and amphibians survive the same catastrophe? The dinosaurs and many marine reptiles were all mysteriously wiped out and fossilized, while many other smaller and more environmentally sensitive animals lived. How could such an impact be powerful enough to wipe out all the tough, thick-skinned dinosaurs, but leave behind the fragile, thin-skinned frogs and amphibians? The same goes for sensitive clams.
Like a big scary flood? Sure. Okay, the next good while of this video is just repetitions of the same arguments, and I'm skipping them.
There's something else that doesn't quite line up with the asteroid extinction theory. If the asteroid was responsible for the ultimate dinosaur wipeout, how did all the delicate creatures like mammals, frogs, birds, insects, fish, plants, and amphibians survive the same catastrophe? The dinosaurs and many marine reptiles were all mysteriously wiped out and fossilized, while many other smaller and more environmentally sensitive animals lived. How could such an impact be powerful enough to wipe out all the tough, thick-skinned dinosaurs, but leave behind the fragile, thin-skinned frogs and amphibians? The same goes for sensitive clams.
That's a good question. As it turns out, the major cause of death on a global scale following the impact was not actually death from the direct blast. Relatively few creatures on a global scale would have died directly from such an event. And further, the creatures most likely to survive the direct blast would be those living underground or underwater, which describes a lot of the mammals, insects, and amphibians that survived. As for the other insects and birds, well, many would be far enough away from the direct blast to survive, and then be able to fly back. The main cause of death was actually starvation, as the dust cloud from the impact would have persisted for probably months. This would mean that plants didn't get enough sunlight, and while their seeds probably could have lasted through this, in many cases the adult plants could not. This resulted in the death of most of the plants, which in turn meant herbivores could not find enough to eat, and so they died, which in turn became a problem for carnivores. Now, as it turns out, during an extremely severe calorie shortage, being small is a big advantage. And one of the things you might notice is that everything that survived, with very few exceptions, was small. And the only thing that was pretty big in terms of animals that made it were crocodilians, who have the advantage of being able to go more than a year without eating in some cases. Now, do we know why in every case a certain lineage made it when others did not? No, we don't. But we have good ideas about it, and the pattern of survival is not surprising. Another point is that there was talk about environmentally sensitive animals like amphibians. These creatures are primarily sensitive to pollution because of their water-permeable skin, which allows environmental toxins directly into their tissues. But the problem post-impact was not primarily toxins, so this is not the kind of environmental problem that hits amphibians or fish especially hard when compared to, say, small mammals or birds.
And why do the frog and clam fossils found near dinosaur fossils look the same as frogs and clams today?
Well, first, they don't. No Mesozoic frog or clam is in the same species as any extant one, and frogs and clams happen to be very well adapted to their habitats and lifestyles, and so they undergo only slow morphological changes in most cases. Evolution doesn't predict a uniform rate of morphological change in all lineages. Lineages with extremely well adapted or successfully generalist anatomy will show only very slow morphological change. This happens in mammals, where raccoons are morphologically very similar to the first carnivorans, simply because being a generalist omnivore who can climb trees is a pretty good gig if you can get it, and if you're adapted to it, as both raccoons today and their ancestors were. So why change?
If harmful chemicals and acids can soak right through the porous skin of frogs and amphibians, and silt chokes clam gills, how did they survive and the sturdy dinosaurs perish?
Already covered that.
Evolutionists also believe that small rodent-like mammals that later evolved into humans also somehow survived the asteroid by crawling into holes just a few feet underground.
Yeah, because that protects from both the blast and the initial short-term toxic effects. As it turns out, amphibians too can inhabit burrows. In fact, one group of them, the Sicilians, live entirely underground.
And finally, let's look at the idea presented in these museums that the dinosaurs didn't really die out, they just evolved into birds. This dino-to-bird theory resurfaced in the 1960s as a rescuing device for evolution.
So this has been addressed pretty well in terms of why birds are dinosaurs, and I also plan on doing some videos in the future going through the various fossils and clades getting closer and closer to crown aves. In the meantime, if you're watching this now and want my discussion on this, I suggest you watch my opening statement from my debate with Kent Hovind.
But the facts show that at least 120 species of birds were living at the same time as dinosaurs.
Right, because birds evolved in the mid-Jurassic, as one of many lines of dinosaurs. This is just the same argument as, if humans evolved from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? The answer is that because evolution is a branching tree, when two branches split, they can both still continue to survive and evolve. Birds are but one branch of dinosaurs, just as humans are but one branch of monkey.
Including numerous modern-looking birds like loons.
Loons evolved in the Eocene. They did not live with non-avian dinosaurs. They are not found in Mesozoic rocks.
Parrots.
Maybe. The fossil record for parrots is spotty, and the molecular studies indicate that they could have possibly evolved around the time of the late Cretaceous.
Flamingos.
Flamingos evolved in the Eocene. They did not live with non-avian dinosaurs. They are not found in Mesozoic rocks.
Cormorants.
First, that picture was a stork, not a cormorant. Specifically, it's a juvenile brown pelican, or Pelecanus occidentalis. But yeah, there were probably cormorants in the late Cretaceous.
Sandpipers.
Yep, they almost certainly evolved before the KPG extinction.
Owls.
Owls evolved in the Paleogene. They did not live with non-avian dinosaurs. They are not found in Mesozoic rocks.
Penguins.
Kind of. Stem penguins had diverged from other birds by the end of the Cretaceous, but they were still flying seabirds. More like an albatross than a penguin in morphology. The waddling, flightless swimmers of today are far more recent.
Avocates.
Well, you pronounced it wrong, but the picture helped. But avocets evolved in the Eocene. They did not live with non-avian dinosaurs. They are not found in Mesozoic rocks.
Ducks and numerous waterfowl.
Kind of. Waterfowl, yes, but ducks per se, no. The modern waterfowl families of Anhimidae, who are an obscure group from South America, the Anserenatidae, or magpie geese, and Anatidae, the ducks, swans, and geese, had not evolved by the end Cretaceous.
Dinosaur footprints have been found right alongside bird footprints.
Which wouldn't be possible in flood sediments or tsunami sediments. Go on.
The fact is that birds have existed alongside land creatures since the Creation Week.
There was no Creation Week, and birds evolved in the Middle Jurassic, So there were a lot of animals, other dinosaurs included, who were around long before the first bird.
The evidence for a worldwide flood wiping out the dinosaurs is everywhere. These evidences sure point to the rapid and widespread catastrophe of the flood.
No.
But do you know what seems even more convincing? Soft tissue found in dinosaur bones. Over the last few decades, scientists have been discovering soft tissues in dinosaur bones. We're talking about over 50 peer-reviewed secular science journals that have now reported 14 bioorganic materials found in dinosaur bones. They're finding blood cells, blood vessels, connective tissue, and even collagen, which has a maximum shelf life of just tens of thousands of years, with some stretching it out to a maximum of 900,000 years. Either way, with a maximum shelf life of less than 1 million years, what's collagen doing in dinosaur bones that are supposedly 65 million years old?
Couple things. Turns out we were wrong about the shelf life of these things, and what is being found is generally not the original molecules, but rather what's called a molecular fossil, where elements such as iron have replaced some of the original atoms in the proteins, allowing them to last much longer. But this is unusual, and was only discovered accidentally. But once the method to recover such molecular fossils was known, people started looking in areas with similar chemistry to the area where the first such find was unearthed. The first such find being Dr. Mary Schweitzer's find of soft tissue in a Tyrannosaurus rex bone. The other thing is that the initial very impressive video of the macroscopic sheet of brown tissue being teased apart with tweezers, yeah, that's from Mark Armitage. He's not a paleontologist, and I've read his paper on this find many times. It's worthless. He claims that this tissue came from a Triceratops horn, and while it did come from a horn, there's currently no way to know if it was a Triceratops horn. He only took one in-situ picture of the horn, and the associated bones he found with it, which he did not take in-situ pictures of, are more consistent with the identification of the find being a bison than a Triceratops. You might find that hard to believe, but in fact the first Triceratops specimen ever found was originally misidentified as a bison specimen. The two animals had similarly sized and shaped horns, so it's really not that hard a mistake to make. Compounding this problem is that Armitage does not give a specific location for his find or a site map, meaning that the find has no provenance, which just like in archaeology, makes the find completely worthless. Further, this paper makes no attempt to justify the assignment of the horn to genus Triceratops, simply baldly asserting that that's what it is. And to add to this, the horn can no longer be examined because it fractured on the way to the lab, but even then, insufficient pictures were taken of it before it was soaked in various acid baths to eat away the bone and rock. Even worse than this, visible contamination from several sources is apparent on what photos there are. Armitage even mentions it. Also, the general area where Armitage allegedly found the bone has both Maastrichtian and Pleistocene deposits known to contain Triceratops horridus and Bison latifrons, respectively. While this is more incompetence than fraud, which I suppose is a step up from Mr. Chadwick from earlier, who one way or another is being dishonest with the data, it is still a display of stunningly bad methodology, which is why anyone even vaguely familiar with paleontology simply dismisses the whole study outright. The whole thing is just garbage from the word go.
Many dinosaur bones are even found unfossilized in places like Madagascar, Alaska, and Montana.
First, a fossil need not be permineralized, and many permineralized bones actually do have some of the original bone left. But also, citation needed, because the only person I've been able to find saying that he found such bones is Buddy Davis, and he has yet to publish on the matter, and it's been a few decades, so I'm not holding my breath.
Even the founder of the largest dinosaur museum in the world admitted that usually most of the original bone is still present in a dinosaur fossil.
Right, because as the soft tissue decays, minerals infill the space left behind. But bone is already basically rock. It's just rock created by a living thing, much like a clamshell.
Just look at this soft, pliable dinosaur tissue. This type of bioorganic material has been found in the bones of several different dinosaur species. It sure doesn't look like a 65 million year old rock, does it?
No, because it's not. It's a 66+ million year old molecular fossil.
When you step back and look at all this evidence, doesn't it look like the catastrophic worldwide flood described in the Bible that happened just thousands of years ago make better sense of this evidence?
Nope, not even a little bit. In fact, in just doing research for this one series of videos, I found more than a dozen journal articles that soundly refute the flood, including 2 from creationists, and several that this video actually used to support its argument. And that's all for the series. Thank you for watching. Please remember to hit like, and if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and remember to hit the bell. And unfortunately, because the YouTube likes to add as many layers as possible between you and my content, if you haven't checked, make sure that you have under the bell all notifications so that way you're actually informed when I have new uploads. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I'd like to just take a moment to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above: Ben Tovand, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, and the Venerable Bede. My channel members and patrons help make this a much more stable income, because as you might know, ad income varies wildly from month to month, even with the same number of views. And it really helps this channel stay on the air. But if a monthly pledge, or a yearly pledge, which I have now activated, isn't right for you, there's a merch store linked in the description, and every like, share, and subscription really helps the channel grow. Also, starting this month, those pledging $10 or above will have access to free 3D art assets, including materials and models, which will be made for Blender by me and can be used in any project without crediting me